Jesse had, of course, posted this post on his. I guess he also posted it on our Medium, but he posted it on his Substack. So this is on behavior, purpose, and teleology, enduring insights from a cybernetics classic. So this is the 1943 paper by Rosenbleuth, Wiener, and Bigelow. And they talk about in this paper about behavior in, which is about 80 years ago, the state of the art of behavior, behavior in animals, behavior in computational agents, et cetera, et cetera. Although those, distinctions weren't made back then, they did talk about behavior, maybe of a feedback system or something else. And they did this typology where you have, behavior, and then you have this breakdown between active and non-active, passive and active. So non-active is passive. Purposeful and non-purposeful. If you follow behavior to active, you go to purposeful and non-purposeful. If you go down the route of purposeful, you go to feedback and non-feedback. This is teleological and non-teleological. You go down the road of feedback, you go to predictive versus non-predictive, or extrapolative versus non-extrapolative. And then down the road of predictive, being first, second, etc. orders of prediction. So this is like first order, second order, feedback, etc. So, and then we did a presentation to the Active Inference Institute where, we broke this typology down and switched around some of these terms, switched around the point of view so that, if you say didn't have active behavior but passive behavior, what would that look like? Or if you had active behavior that was non-purposeful, what would that look like? Or feedback that was non-teleological. And so we flipped this around a bit and played with the typology, which I think was a useful exercise because it allowed us to kind of consider that, first of all, their typology is based on this idea of, it sort of leads you down the railroad of, if behavior is active, then these things are also true. And, because as you can see from this diagram, you're going down one path of what could be a tree of, I don't know how many options, 16 options, I guess, at least, because you have branches that go from these, from each option, and then you get other sort of distinctions that are made. So that is something that we revisited in November at the Active Inference Symposium. We got, Jesse did this wonderful blog post. We did the presentation, and I'm still working kind of on a write-up of that. I'm not quite sure what it's going to look like in its final form. I think it is a worthwhile exercise to kind of walk through this typology, but also consider sort of the counterfactuals. In other words, what is it? What happens when you flip these around and you consider maybe that the purposeful versus non-purposeful distinction is not always the most useful one, or teleological versus non-teleological. Thinking about that also in the modern context of 80 years of neuroscience, 80 years of computational agent research, 80 years of other types of research as well, psychological research, and things like evolutionary biology and developmental biology. So that's very interesting. The other thing is, of course, we did this at the Active Inference Institute, so they're interested in active behavior. And, there was this, I didn't really get a lot of feedback from people. Other than that, it was pretty interesting. But I was kind of hoping for a little bit more sort of discussion, and maybe if we get the paper done, we can do like a live stream or something. I don't know. It would be kind of nice to get questions from people about, what their perspective is on this. Of course, active inference is active behavior, and then from there, I don't know where it fits into this hierarchy, probably in a number of slots. So, anyways, that's neither here nor there. This is a nice post that talks about this paper. And yeah, I guess the discussion group, they talked about this paper in the context of some of the things, like we talked about last week. We talked about the reading group and some of the papers they'd selected and why maybe they selected the papers that they did. So, I'm just wondering how, I know kind of maybe how this fits into what they're thinking about. If we go back to that, we talked about, like, they had a few papers on like evolutionary and developmental landscapes. They had some other papers on, like, thermodynamics and energetics. And so it'd be uninteresting to think about where this paper fits into the other papers they've been reading in the group there. So that's another thing I wanted to point out. Yeah, and then there's some really interesting assertions within the paper, I think, that are interesting. There's behavior versus function, which is, of course, the idea that there's this distinction between behavior and function, and maybe that's the distinction between maybe purposeful and non-purposeful. Although function has its own problems as a concept, that some of them predate scientific inquiry. Some of them are kind of, we ascribe a function to something when maybe a function doesn't exist. And then there are functions that aren't behavioral. So that's why we have the distinction in the first place. So, there are a lot of interesting distinctions to be made there. Purposeful behavior is voluntary. Okay, so you have to have some sort of voluntary movement or voluntary action. And it's, purposeful, at least in terms of the way we think about like goal-directed movements and things like that. And so that's, that may not actually be the case. We don't necessarily, people are, as much as I hate free will arguments, that might come into play here. And again, I don't want to go down that road too much, but, this is an assumption that I think is widely sort of assumed in behavioral science. So, okay. Teleology is purpose controlled by negative feedback, and then they talk about negative feedback and the role of attenuating things and making them more refined. And so, if feedback is something that we have available to us, is it that we utilize it in a purposeful way, or is it that there's just this sort of, it gets refined over some other mechanism? Yeah, it's hard to say, but basically, like saying, if I'm making limb movements, like arm movements, or if I'm making leg movements and I'm controlling my movements, there's a lot of negative feedback in that, and it sort of attenuates my movements. Is that all voluntary, or is that all purposeful, or what? There's goal-directed movements, and of course there are reflexive movements. So, and of course, back at the time of this paper was written, there weren't huge distinctions made between them. So I don't know where we would land on that if we revisited these specific points. Prediction, extrapolation, and coordinates, and talking about servo mechanisms in particular. So servo mechanisms are like robotic arms, basically. So one of the things they're interested in cybernetics was controlling things for mechanical systems. So, you're thinking about controlling a robot arm, which is a servo mechanism, which moves back and forth, and you can kind of predict, the movements there, linear movements. And yeah, so that their interest is in that. And the idea is that you see this in biology as well, where you have arm movements or limb movements in different types of animals. You also have, responses to stimuli, which are also kind of like servo mechanism in nature. Now, I think it's interesting in cybernetics, and I don't know if we've talked about this in the cybernetics meetings or not, that, you kind of go from this goal of information processing in like, computational systems and mechanical systems. And then there's this period where it just kind of branches out into everything. So, like, instead of kind of just focusing, and I don't mean that they needed to, I don't mean to say that they should have stuck to technology, but they kind of tried to take those ideas and expand them out to like society and all sorts of different application domains. So it's interesting that like in cybernetics they had some success and then they tried to kind of go to everything. It's kind of like a little bit we talked about, I think, complexity theory last week. We were talking about how complexity theory has this aspect of universality to it, where the assumption is that complexity theory has they're trying to find these rules of order, they're trying to find these mathematical descriptions, but that they apply broadly to many different types of systems. So you can go from like socio-technical systems to purely social systems, to technological systems, to other types of systems like biological systems, and you should find networks, say, or dynamical systems with the same governing rules, the same governing dynamics, the same governing constraints, more or less. You just have to fit the method to the context, and once you do that, it should behave in a similar way. And, there have been papers published where people looked at different types of networks, looked at networks that were technical, networks that were biological, networks that were social, and they're able to extract these topologies that are basically the same or that follow similar rules. And by that, what I'm referring to is sort of the idea of scale-free networks and other types of network topologies like that, where you can describe it with a statistical term, and that statistical term not only is sort of fits the data, but means something. It means that the network has a certain behavior or certain properties. So, that is basically, I think there's a parallel there in cybernetics that is interesting, and I don't think people have talked about like the connections between the cybernetics program and the complexity theory program and sort of the meta science there, what they were trying to achieve with it. And I think they're trying to achieve more or less the same thing, because you have this, we're trying to have this sort of theory of everything mathematical framework or quantitative framework. And, I don't know if cybernetics was a failure or not, but it certainly isn't as prevalent as, say, complexity theory is today. So, there is this sort of common goal and, why we're doing something. And when we say behavior here, we're talking about this very broad category of things. This is why we have this typology up here, but we also have complexity theory in the mix. And in complexity theory, you could break down complexity in a similar way. You could have like, and I think, I'm not sure if the paper exists. I haven't gone back to look, but I'm pretty sure that some of the Santa Fe people have thought about this, where they're thinking about different classes. Well, I know that there are people like Stephen Wolfram have done these sort of typologies of classes of complexity. But what I'm thinking about here more specifically is like the behavioral output of a complex system. If you have a behavioral output of a complex system that has certain properties, what does that look like in relation to other complex systems? In other words, are we justified in comparing social systems and biological systems when they have different properties that might map to this topology, where you have active behavior versus non-active behavior, feedback versus non-feedback, predictive versus non-predictive. And so if I take a complex network, for example, can I fit that model to anything in the world? It's like, can I fit a network to? We know that there's some systems that are very amenable to network analysis, social interactions, biological interactions, systems that are wired together, and that's an obvious application of network theory. But people have tried to apply network theory to many other things. So if that's true, that's great. But there are going to be differences in these systems that need to be kind of thought through and broken down in this type of typology. Okay, so finishing up on this blog post, again, yeah, Jesse did a very good job of kind of walking through some of these other things, talking about every good regulator theorem, and then getting into selected modern works of interest. And these are largely works that we visited in our reading groups. Margaret Bowden, who of course did this book, Mind is Machine, A History of Cognitive Science, and talking about the historical antecedents of cognitive science and how they kind of go back into psychology and cybernetics and other things. Thomas Fuchs, of course, we talked about the ecology of the brain, and this is a critique of reductionism and mechanistic approaches, and and kind of talks about embodiment, things like that. Valentino Breitenberg, of course, wrote the Vehicles book. I'm not really sure if Valentino Breitenberg wrote anything else. I think there's such a focus on that book, but he's probably done other things. I really don't know what those would be, but that's something for later to investigate.
Mostly neuroscience.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, he was very distinctively neuroscience oriented with like some of the things that he was doing. But I mean, like, are there any other papers that were really that I would recognize? He did seem to like take a neuroanatomy approach to the vehicles, so that's very apparent there. But then the behavioral aspects were actually very much like what they're doing in the Rosenbleuth paper, and it's like there's this sort of characterizing the behaviors in ways that are not like maybe modern or maybe not as if you were like a I don't know, some sort of behavioral scientist nowadays, you would think his characterization of behavior is really um, low level, let's just say. So, so there's Bradenberg, and then there's Mike Levin, and then there's David Krakauer, who we talked about last week. And that was, of course, the basis for this reading group's. The readings, they come from this, what was the points that were raised in this book, and talking about teleonomic matter, and talking about some other aspects of complexity theory, information theory of individuality, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I like revisiting this post because it's really long and really has a lot of good stuff.